WLRN Video presents.
Welcome to another Women's Liberation Radio News extended interview. My name is April No, WLRN Canadian member and ever aspiring optimist. In this interview, Thistle sat down with Renée Gerlich, a radical feminist from Wellington, New Zealand. Renée is a published author, most recently writing, illustrating, and publishing A Brief Herstory, a thoroughly researched illustrated text in 7 parts. The series offers an overview of women's history from the, quote, Big Bang to the present day in bite-sized chunks. Also in this interview, she discusses her upcoming course entitled Everything I Wish I Had Known, a 4-part series where she reconciles politics, healing, and spiritual work, and tackles the delicate balance between the needs of the individual versus the needs of the collective, all from a feminist perspective. Everything I Wish I Had Known is set to be available in the near future. Please make sure to contact Renée if interested in taking the course. Her email has been provided in the description. Also in the description will be a link to the site where you can purchase A Brief Herstory. You don't want to miss out on Renée's beautifully described and illustrated women's herstory. This WLRN member feels like this is crucial work, sisters, emotional and political work. If we wish to attempt to heal our sisters and this magnificent planet we live on, we must be courageous enough to heal ourselves, to put in the emotional work of critical self-reflection. I hope you enjoy this interview WLRN founding member Thistle Pettersen conducted with the indelible Renée Gerlich. Listen now.
All right, so welcome Renée to WLRN. It's so great to have you back on the show.
Thank you so much, Thistle. It's so good to be back as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so a lot has happened in your professional life since the last time we talked. You've published a series of 7 books called A Brief Herstory. And I just want to say I'm so glad that I was able to get them in the mail. You sent them to me from New Zealand, and they actually came pretty quickly. And that they've just been a joy physically to read, because on each page, you know, there are these beautiful drawings and paintings that illustrate what you're talking about. And so I just wanted to ask you, like, what was your inspiration for doing the Brief Herstory series?
Yeah, I've actually, perhaps ambitiously, perhaps obnoxiously, titled it The Brief Complete Herstory series, even though obviously it isn't complete. But I guess I mean complete as in it's an entire overview, rather than being about a specific moment or period in history. And that's what I wanted. So I grew up really craving some kind of stylized, potted story of, like, that could help me figure out where I am in the world, how to situate myself, how to understand myself in relation to human origins and the origins of life. And I know that, you know, I think this is a really human craving to have this kind of story, because, you know, Indigenous cultures all have creation stories and tend also to have a way of tracing your own lineage back to these origins. And, you know, my parents immigrated from Holland, and I grew up in New Zealand. And I found it really bewildering, kind of disorientating to, you know, grow up in a culture where I didn't have any cultural roots. And I think that added to my real need to have some way of understanding who are all these strangers around me, What's the basis for my connection with them? What the hell is going on in the world? Yeah, and you know, I grew up in the 80s, 90s when, you know, I just remember always watching the news and seeing evidence of like the famines in Africa and seeing starving children on the news every night, and just thinking, between that and going to school and experiencing sexual harassment there a lot, just that sense of confusion about what is this world I live in, who are these people, who can I trust, what's going on. Yeah, so that led me to really want some kind of story, and so I ended up making one. And yeah, so it's a potted, stylized history of the world from the Big Bang to the present day, but from a female-centered perspective, so that women like the young woman I was can relate to it directly in the way that I wish to be able to relate to history. I couldn't relate to mainstream or mainstream history, and I couldn't relate to mythology. I tried my best. I was fascinated by it, but I could never relate to, you know, the European origin myths that I had access to. And so, yeah, these books are they're compiled out of all the reading that I've done. So feminist historians, archaeologists, I've, you know, made sure to read enough to be able to put this history together and fill all the gaps where there were any in my understanding. So yeah, it takes you through that period as well of the classical, you know, the classics, you know, where I draw on Maria Gimbutas, who helps shed light on why those Greek myths are so bewildering for women and confusing. Yeah, so and I find that as I've put this together, it's had every book that I've read that has added to my understanding and to my sense of having this kind of story and narrative. Everything I've read has had a visceral impact on me. I'm sure you've had that as well, Thistle, where you read books and it's like the cells in your body respond. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's a really visceral experience. And so these books are created out of all the books that gave me that experience. And so that allowed me to have a story which helps me to feel more like I'm inside of my life rather than looking at life from outside going, what the hell is going on?
Yeah. I'm glad that you emphasize that it's a brief, complete herstory, because you start at the very, very beginning, and it sets the reader up for this sense of awe about the origin of life in general, and asking these very philosophical questions like, what are we doing here? How did we get here? What's going on? And then it is brief, but there's so much detail and so much energy, that energy that you were talking about that you get from reading books that you can feel vibrating in your cells is captured in the pages of these books, because there's the illustrations that demonstrate what the words are talking about in this really vibrant way. And what I wanted to talk about was the beauty aspect of the books and how that contrasts with hard science. Though your books are clearly well-researched and factually based and answer so many questions. I agree with you. It's like you read them and then you feel like, oh, okay, now I can walk in my life, in the world, and sort of understand things better. But these books bring me to a state of reverence that hard science doesn't. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that, and if that was part of your way of doing it that's different than patriarchal science, and brings in a more feminist aspect to writing about facts,
Yeah, I mean, the hard science thing, the dispassionate tone of most science is, I think, something that's contrived. It's not real. It's not true. I mean, life is inexplicable. It's completely miraculous. Like, it's amazing. And anything you read that's, anywhere near the truth will reflect that. And I actually feel like my writing in the book is kind of in the background. I really saw myself as compiling or curating the readers, the writers who brought me, reconnected me with that sense of awe. So in that first book that you're talking about, I draw a lot from three writers in particular. Rachel Carson, who wrote the book The Sea Around Us, who speaks about the sea and about water and about the evolution of life out of the sea in this absolutely beautiful way. She's got this incredible magical combination of she was such a staunch, uncompromising environmentalist, and a biologist, a marine biologist, but she was a writer's writer at the same time, an absolute wordsmith and a poet. So being able to draw on, what she says about the sea and our origins in the sea and the connection between the sea and the womb is just beautiful. And then Monica Shaw, who wrote the book The Great Cosmic Mother, which is also a complete herstory, and an amazing book. It's again incredibly written, very sound, but also asks all these. It's philosophically grounded, so it's not there's nothing surface about it. Monica Shaw is such a great mind, so she opens her book with the line, "In the beginning was a very female sea," and I think that's quite a powerful opening line in a world where we're supposed to think that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and God was a man. So and I've just found that reading people like Shaw and Carson have just I feel like it's revealing when your reading speaks to the cells in your body and wakes them up rather than kind of intimidates you.
Whole. And I was wondering if you could talk about individualism versus collectivism in women's liberation movement, and kind of connect that to the Spinning and Weaving essay, which opens up this amazing book that just came out, I think at the beginning of 2021, and your essay is the first one. And it's just a wonderful introduction to the whole book. And it's called On 21st Century Patriarchy and the Place of Women's Hearts in Women's Movement. Fantastic title. And so, and in it, there's so much about, reformism in women's politics versus radicalism, and also individualism versus collectivism. And I was wondering if you could talk about that in your work in general.
Okay, yes. It's actually my favorite thing to talk about, but also such a massive question. But it has been the question that has been on the forefront of my mind for the last 2 years, is the question of, individualism versus collectivism, and, looking at other supposed or apparent contradictions within politics, because we are supposed to believe in a sort of either or. Like, there's this really interesting phenomenon where there's the different political traditions that we know, in our daily lives. So you have conservatism, which, you have liberalism, you have the left, and they all promote a different set of values. So the liberals promote freedom and individualism, and the conservatives promote the family and responsibility, and the left is against capitalism, and they focus on, the material conditions in which people live and transforming those through collective action. So in that way, all of these different traditions define themselves very much in relation to each other, and you've got to choose your political home out of these. But what I've started to realize is that actually none of these traditions have a monopoly on the particular values that they promote. And I don't accept that liberals care about the individual at all. They don't. Liberalism is the ideology that sustains capitalism, and capitalism is antithetical to individual freedom. It makes drones of people. So what I started to realize at a certain point was that these stated values that supposedly define each of these different traditions, they don't. Loyalties define politics, not values. So when conservatives talk about the family and they talk about responsibility, they're actually just creating a rhetoric, they're shaping a rhetoric that serves the purpose of promoting the interests of the particular people who they really support. In the case of conservatives, that's the male householder, the white male householder. So they will only care about responsibility and the family as far as it serves the interests of the white male householder. In other words, they don't care about family or responsibility at all. And as soon as women say, hey, you know, I want to take responsibility for my own body and I want to make my own choices about my own body, they say, no, you have to do what we say. We're going to make the laws about your body. Where did responsibility go? We're not allowed it. Women aren't allowed it, according to conservatives. But we get beaten around the head for not having it if we're single mothers, because there's no male householder in that family to care about. And that's who conservatives care about. So with liberals, you know, you have this so-called promotion of individualism and freedom, which is basically, you know, liberalism supports capitalism. So this is the rhetoric that supports consumerism. You can buy whatever you want in order to be whoever you are. Your individuality is expressed through your consumer purchases. And only insofar as that's what individualism and freedom mean, is it something to be supported. You know, if you're a woman with a voice and you go, hey, I've got a truth I want to speak, you should really shut up, according to the liberals. Like, they're not going to have that. That's not the kind of individuality that they care about. So then the question is, you know, like, if you just look at all these political traditions as they are, which is to say they support these particular groups of people, male householders, free marketeers, and for the left, workers, male workers. I think feminism is distinct from those other traditions for a couple of reasons. One is that it's explicit about its loyalties. Feminism, it's in the name, it's about women. We're not lying. We're not saying, you know, we're not naming ourselves after a particular set of values. We're saying, no, we'll be honest, like, we're for women, because that's who needs advocacy in this world where everyone else is supporting the interests of men and dominating the sphere. We're about women. But the other thing that happens when you're about women is that you can embrace all of these values. You don't have to choose. You can be for the individual, you can be for the collective, you can be for the family, I've reached the understanding as well that freedom and responsibility are the same thing. They're exactly the same thing. They're synonymous. Part of the reason that people fear freedom is because if you're free, there's no one else to blame your actions on. Like, if you're free, if you are free, only you choose what you do, and therefore only you are accountable for those choices. Freedom and responsibility go together. So reclaiming freedom is reclaiming responsibility. So to me, a real feminist paradigm is a paradigm in which we take back all those values and say, actually, first of all, no, I don't think you care about those things. And secondly, no, you don't have a monopoly on them. we're going to show you as women what all of this stuff means to us. And to me, the political voice, the political figure who, or one of them, who best captures this is Paulo Freire. So his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yeah, I've read that. Very inspiring work.
I first read it 10 years ago, and it really changed my life. And then I just reread it recently, and that's when I saw how much it had changed my life, because I saw that so many of the decisions that I'd made over the last 10 years and so many of the warning signs that I ever saw, or the things that I felt the need to point out, I'd forgotten that. I think a lot of that was informed by this book. Like when I reread it, I was like, this book has been informing me for the last decade, and I don't know. Yeah, it's incredible. But so he talks about liberation as the process of humanization. So he basically, this is one of the books that, I don't know if Paulo Freire called himself an anarchist, but it's one of the books that made an anarchist out of me. Like, he doesn't understand freedom as being something that is a destination, or something that is hypothetical, or something that is bestowed from above, that you have to ask for and you might receive if you're lucky, or if you work hard enough, or you negotiate long enough, or if you use the right words, to talk to the people who are keeping your freedom from you. He says that, the same thing that actually spiritual teachers all talk about, and so do feminists and other people who are involved in critical political activism. They all talk about the conditioned mind. The conditioned mind is something that spiritual teachers and radical activists have in common, that we understand exists. And so what Paulo Freire says is the process of liberation. Well, it's like the conditioned mind is basically the internalized oppressor. You internalize the demands, expectations, norms of the oppressor, so that you basically have a mini oppressor inside of you. Mm-hmm. And he says that the process of liberation is the process of ejecting that oppressor. And as soon as you do that, you relate differently to your life situation, and you act differently within your life situation. And as soon as you do that, the situation changes. And then, when that starts happening on a collective level, you have a cultural change. This is what I've been hungering for the whole time that I've been a feminist. But yeah, we're talking about different strategies and different responses to living under patriarchy. I find that the default response is reformism based on negotiation. And underlying reformism and underlying negotiation is either a conscious or an unconscious belief that freedom is in the hands of authority figures, and you have to convince them to give you some. But first of all, that's not true. It cannot be true. Secondly, it's futile. They're not going to give it to you even if they had it, even if they could. And thirdly, Paulo Freire says that, the grand historic task of the oppressed is to free themselves and the oppressor as well. Like, it's a fundamental paradox.
I love that about that book.
Yeah.
It's so compassionate.
Yeah, but he talks about how it's a fundamental paradox to expect that the oppressor can or will grant freedom. And actually, Sonia Johnson makes statements about this. There's a couple of YouTube videos that Liz Miller, actually, the editor of Spinning and Weaving, sent to me, where she's like, she talks about Roe versus Wade, because she has the same view about freedom not being something that you can ask for or even demand from authority figures. And then she talks about how, while she's trying to talk about this with feminists, she gets a lot of resistance because they're very attached to this campaigning, reformist, negotiating mode, because it's how we've been conditioned. We've been conditioned to negotiate with power, not to, just reclaim,
our own authority and
our own
ability
authority.
and take action that impacts our lives.
Yeah. So she mentions Roe versus Wade as one example that feminists would often bring to her, so the legalization of abortion as a victory that was gained through reformism and through negotiation. And then Sonia Johnson says, look, a couple of responses to that, and the main one that she offers is, look, well, she says, first of all, if you're in this negotiation bargaining mode, sometimes they're going to be like, okay, we'll give you something. Here you go. You've worked so hard, and we're doing all this other crap over here that we don't really want you to look at. So if we give you this, maybe, just for now, and then you can celebrate. And it's always temporary. But the other thing she says is, if they can let you, then they own you. So in a way, these moments that we might look back on and see as being victories, in some way reinforce that So I just think that I'm very aware that a lot of people become very uncomfortable with, questioning reformism or questioning law change, or the emphasis on legislative change as a path to freedom. But in my own view, it's not that you shouldn't do those things. It's not that we shouldn't speak to authority figures or we shouldn't tell them what's in women's interests. For me, it's everything is about what's your starting point. And that's what Paulo Freire is really I think Pedagogy of the Oppressed is such a key text in illustrating, because if your liberatory work is about the process of humanization, ejecting the oppressor from your mind, reclaiming your life, and if you take the position, that Thich Nhat Hanh book is that's called Freedom is Every Step, I think that phrase says so much. If you take the position that freedom is every step, that the work of liberation, of reclaiming autonomy, of finding out what freedom is actually and how it feels, and that is every step, that's a very, very different approach from taking for granted that you're not free, you probably can't have freedom in your lifetime, but that if you work really hard and you are very charitable and think of other future generations, maybe you'll be able to get a scrap more for them than you had in your lifetime. That's a very, very, very different approach. And I would say as well that the latter approach of, treating freedom as something hypothetical that can be granted, rather than something real that can be lived. If you do that, I feel like actually that conforms exactly to the gender norm, the gender category that women are supposed to embody. So we're supposed to be selfless, not in the true spiritual sense, but in the interests of men. So we're supposed to continuously repress our desire for freedom in our own lifetime, repress our desire for, an expansive voice, a whole life, a creatively fulfilling,
actualized,
existence.
You've been able to create your personhood and actualize your potential. Yeah.
We're supposed to repress all that for others, which to me is a lie. It's not possible. It is not possible to repress yourself and have other people benefit from the harm that does you. Like, it just, nobody ever benefits from that. And I would say, I know I'm ranting maybe a little bit, but I would say as well, Gabor Mate is a wonderful, his book When the Body Says No is a great resource. He talks about what happens to the body when you internalize the voice of the oppressor. You set up this inner conflict. It leads to literal, visceral disease. It doesn't serve anybody. So when we treat feminism as like a charity, a charitable cause, you know, we're here for all women, but we're not here for ourselves, which means we're actually not here for any women. Because, you know what I mean? Like, if you're not meant to feel that feminism is about you as an individual, and no woman feels that, then who is it for, actually?
Right.
We're all just talking about this abstract category of what woman that no individual is supposed to feel. I don't mean think, I mean feel that she belongs to, because she can feel that this movement sees her and hears her and she's living it. You know, if we're all meant to repress that in order to work for a charity, who's around to be, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I find that kind of strange. I want to be part of a real living, you know, energetic, passionate, creative movement that actually feels like a life to be part of. And I'm not going to sit around at committee meetings writing letters to politicians. I don't mean to sound condescending, but if that's what it's going to be, you can count me out. Like, I'll be here making my illustrations, like reading because it makes me feel alive, not because I'm being diligent. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway,
yeah,
I don't mean as well to set up like a really rigid polarization between reformism and like anarchism or you know, my position, but I think it is helpful to understand or to discuss the fact that there are different ways of approaching the situation, and that reformism does tend to be the default, and that it's not a requirement if you're a feminist to be a reformist. You can reflect on whether or not, you know, that is how you view freedom and how you think freedom is gained.
You are listening to WLRN.
Wow, there's a lot there for sure. So, and you know, that excitement that you're talking about, that creative energy or gynergy that Mary Daly talks about. And also she talks about the cultivation of the self with a capital S in women because of all the years of being trained and conditioned to be in the subservient, subordinated role in this hierarchy of the male over the female in patriarchy, how it's a radical act and an act of liberation for the individual woman to cultivate herself with a capital S. And how maybe collective liberation then for women is, once that oppressor has been ejected from the mind, once that self has been cultivated, or you're on a path of self-cultivation and it feels like a normal part of life to be in your life, and you know, obviously we can't control everything and direct everything, but we can be in a flow, in a creative flow, and feel that gynergy and that excitement. And to just be alive can be so pleasurable. So once that happens in individual women, in Mary Daly's vision, she starts talking about women coming together in collectives, in clusters, and what that might do for women's liberation for all women. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because that legislative piece, I totally hear what you're saying. You're not going to find me in committee meetings either, or writing tons of letters to politicians. But at the same time, what does women's liberation, real women's liberation, look like then?
Yeah. I actually think the second wave offers a really, really clear example, and I believe that the spirit of second wave feminism, that 70s and 80s movement, was one in which individual freedom and collective freedom were not seen as distinct. That's why they came up with that slogan, "The personal is political." And to me, there's this phenomenon that we're living through now, where in that period of the 1970s and 80s, feminist groups around the world actually were really formed out of consciousness raising, out of individual women coming together and doing the work that Paulo Freire describes in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Basically, the book is about consciousness raising. And consciousness raising is this phenomenon of coming together and going, I'm in this particular situation. It feels isolating. It feels dehumanizing. I feel shame. I feel all of these things for being in the situation, because it is as if nobody else has this problem. And then the next woman would be like, yeah, but I'm in the same situation. And then the next woman's like, so am I. And so the thing that Betty Friedan called the problem that has no name, which is all these women alone, is going like, why can't I enjoy my life? I have a family, I have a home. If they did, in her example, the problem that has no name was, many women in the domestic sphere, like being deeply, deeply dissatisfied. And then thinking there was something wrong with them because they seemed to have everything a person could want. And then you put all those women together and they all say they feel the same way. Well, then they can start to name the problem that has no name. And as they do that, what Paulo Freire says is this has the effect of ejecting the oppressor from the mind, because suddenly there's nothing wrong with you. It's not personal. Your feelings about your situation, your dissatisfaction, is not a reflection of your defectiveness or your incapacity to live up to some standard that you have for yourself, or that you've absorbed for yourself. It's a something that women share. So then what do we do about it? And so in the second wave, the way I understand the second wave is that this then leads women, this understanding leads women to start behaving very differently. And first of all, to start becoming angry. And Sonia Johnson says anger is the first sign of life returning. That's when you stop feeling shame, like, oh, it's all my fault, and you start going, actually, screw this shit. I want better. And what are you doing? And then eventually, when you realize that actually you can't, someone else might be mistreating you. You might be living with say, like a husband who mistreats you. You might start, upon realizing this is a common thing, it's not actually your fault, regardless of how much you've had it drilled into you that you deserve it. No, actually, this is wrong. But then the anger kind of suggests that he should change his behavior, which is ideal, but you can't make that happen. You can't convince someone to change their behavior. They will or they won't, when they do or they don't realize that for themselves. So then there's other options, i.e. divorce. A lot of women in the second wave left these relationships and started to forge new lives for themselves, in which they could envisage themselves outside of this patriarchal model of the housewife, outside of the norms and standards that they'd been given from childhood. This is how you're supposed to live your life. Like feminism, through women going through this process of ejecting the oppressor from their minds, started to create new models of existence for women. They didn't know beforehand what that would look like, because this is the thing about freedom. As opposed to authoritarianism, as opposed to totalitarianism, there aren't any rules. So you can't go looking for what it looks like. You can't go looking for what it feels like. You will make that. The path is made as you walk it. And I feel like the second wave feminists lived that. They discovered that. And then as they encountered obstacles that faced all of them, those are the obstacles they fought together. They didn't fight those obstacles for charity. They didn't fight those obstacles because it was the quote unquote morally right thing to do. They fought those obstacles because they wanted freedom in their own lifetimes. This is my understanding. And obviously, women are not, a monolith. Like, everyone is different. But I think anyone who lived or has studied or knows, second wave texts or, feminist literature from that time can feel the spirit of that moment. And it was not the spirit of negotiation. It was a visionary moment, and I feel like that movement was, I feel like the term women's liberation movement, when you look back to the second wave, it's the name for a phenomenon in which a whole bunch of women start reclaiming their individual lives and then realizing that they can work together in that effort. And I feel like what's happened now is that the second wave left us with this legacy of analysis. They created analysis out of consciousness raising. Consciousness raising alerts you to social patterns. This happened to me, it happened to her, it happened to her, it happened to her. This is a pattern. Out of the patterns, you get analysis. And I feel like what's happening now with transgenderism is that, there was a huge backlash to the second wave of feminism. Women's studies departments got rolled over, replaced with gender studies. There was a massive media and beauty industry backlash to the second wave, which basically invisibilized it as a public, visible movement. So women like me grew up not seeing it in front of us. And now a lot of women, especially because of transgenderism and how crazy it is, are going, why the hell are people all over the place suddenly proclaiming that, sex is not real, or sex can be changed, or sex is a spectrum, or some combination of all three, or they change positions based on the particular person they happen to be defending at the moment. Maybe they're non-binary, maybe they're a lesbian with a penis, so a claimed lesbian, so depending on that, you change your position of sex as a spectrum or not real or whatever. Anyway, why are people doing this? It's absolutely insane. So the only way to understand that is to ask, you discover feminism as a backlash against women and women's liberation. When you open up that question, you start uncovering all the analysis that is the legacy of the second wave. And I feel like nowadays, the movements, the feminism that is prominent, the real feminism that is prominent, not the pole dancing, not that stuff.
Oh, that I'm so free.
Not the liberal
because
misogyny.
I can, wear
Sex
these
workers
clothing
all that
and
stuff.
no.
I don't mean that. I mean the real, the feminism that is prominent in which there is any pretense of like being in the interests of women, tends to be, I feel like it's a movement where the analysis precedes the consciousness raising. A lot of it is happening because women alone at their computers or on the internet or somehow are finding the analysis of the second wave, are finding feminist analysis, and then going, okay, now I understand why some of this shit is going on, and then trying to talk about it and use it in reformist work. But I think that's one of the big differences between feminism now and feminism in the 70s and 80s, is that in the 70s and 80s, feminism was born out of consciousness raising, and I feel like today the analysis is more primary.
Right, it's coming first.
Yes.
It's not it's not rooted in examining, women are not rooting their analysis in their own individual experiences, current experiences, and then sharing. They're learning from women who did that in the past. And so it's a little bit like putting the cart before the horse, and then could result in maybe a little bit of a distancing from like the real material feminism that they were experiencing in the 70s in their own lives.
I will say, I'll mention one way in which I think you can see that, and again, it might be controversial. I totally accept that just about everything I say now is controversial to just about like, I don't know if I have a political home, so I should just throw away any expectation of being palatable to anybody. But so I think one thing that demonstrates this is this phrase, one of the phrases of what we might call, say, gender critical feminism at the moment, or even radical feminism at the moment. One common phrase is, facts don't care about your feelings. And this phrase holds within it some sort of acceptance that liberalism is about the individual, and therefore liberals care about the individual and they care about individual feelings. Okay, that's not true. But that's what the political sphere,
that's how it's marketed. That's how it's marketed to us.
It looks that way. And then radicals tend to find themselves in opposition to that. So then we say, we care about material reality. Material reality doesn't care about your feelings. The thing is, this is, to me, a little disingenuous. I don't know if that's the right word, but read Audre Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. Feelings are absolutely primary in any social movement. They are primary. You are not served by defining yourself in opposition to somebody who cares about feelings. And I understand that facts are neutral. But I feel like, because, again, it's like relating to this idea that feminism today is very analysis driven or based, and this is one thing that reflects that. It's like this, facts don't care about your feelings. It's almost like you can come to pride yourself in being an intellectual over and above someone who cares about feelings at all. But the thing is, feminism is nothing if it's not driven by women's feelings.
Oh yes, and that was so clear from the first line in the Spinning and Weaving essay. I think, let me just read it. It's such a great first line to your essay. Women's heartbreak is the most potent force for freedom in this world. Women carry the pain of living under patriarchy, a system in which 1 in 3 women are raped during their lifetime, and over 130 women are murdered each day around the world by men they know. And so we have feelings about that, and and it breaks our hearts. And so then what happens with all of these heartbroken women? Like, what do we do? How do we use that energy that seeps out of our hearts? How do we harness that energy for our liberation?
Yeah, I have actually two things I want to say to that. One of them is, again, Paulo Freire. I'm sorry, drawing you to a man's book, but Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I just feel like everyone everyone should have it in their letterbox tomorrow. Like I just love that book so much. But it's not just it's basically saying that the process of ejecting the oppressor from you, that process is the work of freedom. Like freedom is every step. That is liberation work. Your own, I know a lot of radical feminists as well are for very good reason skeptical and critical of this idea of self-care. Because that's what we're always fed, like, oh, you're having a bad day, have a bubble bath, like, look after yourself. And basically we see it as condescending and pathologizing. Hey, I don't have a personal problem, I have a fucking cultural problem. So I'm here to tell you about the culture. You don't give me a self-care crap. But again, a lot of these values, as they're presented to us, are appropriations, they're distortions. In actual fact, the deeply personal, quite solitary inner work of ejecting the oppressive from your mind, of overcoming conditioned habits and behavior, isn't separate from political feminism. It's the same thing, and this is something I think Paulo Freire makes really clear. So I think anyone who wants to delve into that idea, that book is amazing.
Let's see. I know you've got current projects that are happening, and one of them is that you are starting a workshop series that women can sign up for on your website. Can you tell us a little bit about what your goal is with these workshop series and what they entail?
Yeah, so my workshops are, so I've made them. They're not available yet. If anyone was interested, I would love to hear expressions of interest. But they basically, I was running workshops, like live workshops for a year before I decided to just make an online course that people could follow in their own time. And the point of the course was to reconcile political realities with healing concern, like healing and spiritual truths. So for a long time, I found these things difficult to reconcile. You know, for instance, within feminism, there's a line that people often cite, which is, no woman is free until all women are free. No woman can be free until all women are free. And that's because, well, it's partly because, for instance, you know, the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. Like if somebody is not free, this is indicative of the wider society, what they're able to accept, and people who can accept, you know, the oppression of others or harm to others cannot themselves be free. It also comes from the idea that freedom is something that you need to have material conditions that enable it. So, you know, poverty is not conducive to freedom. And at the same time, you have spiritual teachers who tell you that, you know, freedom, for instance, Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Freedom is Every Step. The practice of yoga is based on the idea that where your mind is currently split or fragmented or dissociated or conditioned, yoga means union or to yoke, so you can recreate wholeness, you can bring things back together and then make conscious choices, you know, conscious choices in which that are not guided by reactivity or repression, but that come from your whole self in your own life. Like, you know, I found these different conceptions of freedom for a little while to be, I didn't quite know see how they could be reconciled. But I have made a course in which I attempt to do that and reconcile them and show. So the course begins by talking about patriarchy as a cultural and societal reality. And I do that by using Gerda Lerner's work to show the steps through which it was created, to make that really clear. And by showing the steps, you can also see the historic process, but you can also see the different components and also the different concepts that you have to accept in order to accept the whole as a norm, as a normal way of living. And actually before that part, we talk about matriarchy. So, you know, something closer to human origins. How is it that human beings lived before patriarchy existed? And like the way that I share this, and it comes from the texts that I've read and authors who I've read who I share in the videos, it just makes total sense. Like, so I talk about matriarchy being a matriarchal society being both matrilineal and matrilocal, meaning that people trace their lineage through their mother's line because they came out of their mothers, and they have a birthright to living on their mother's lands. And because of that, the culture also honors and reveres women. Women have a voice within the community, not just a domestic sphere, which isn't actually treated as completely distinct from the public sphere as we have in a patriarchy. So as I've learned about this, as I keep saying, it has this visceral resonance. Like it's not like, matriarchy is some kind of feminist projection or utopia or hypothetical, idea. So it talks about that creation of patriarchy, and then it talks about conditioning. So the way that women are conditioned under patriarchy, and the way that specifically we're conditioned into the quote unquote helpmate role, which is also called codependency. And in codependency, the internalization of the oppressor that Paulo Freire talks about, feminists call it the male gaze. So we internalize the male gaze, and we do this like mental leap where we imagine a man looking at us and then modify our behavior in accordance with what we would expect his judgments or expectations or standards to be, which can of course be very confusing depending on which man you want to please, and like whether it's going to be your father today or the man of your dreams or the police, I don't know, like God, like whichever man. So we internalize this male gaze, and this, I draw on Gabor Mate to talk about the health effects that this has, because basically you're internalizing what your stress mechanism considers to be a threat. So then you live on the energy of stress, and that's not good for your body. So talk about that, and then talk about using the signals of the body, which is going to keep on giving you signals if as long as we live that way, using those signals to eject that oppressor, to find a way back to wellness. And I use a lot of different resources to talk about how this path could be taken. I have a couple of stories that I would really love to tell, but I don't know how much time we have. But they make it also like really clear what I mean as well when I talk about the difference between, anarchy versus reformism and stuff like that. So anyway, and then in the last block, there's 4 blocks. In the last block of the course, we talk about growth. What is growth? Like, if you can establish some kind of equilibrium where you don't feel ruled by stress hormones, from there, what does it mean to grow? So that's the course. And if anyone's interested in that, I would love to get expressions of interest. My email address, should I?
Yeah, sure. Say what it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my website is dragoncloudpress.com. That's also where you can get my books. And my email address is renee@dragoncloudpress.com. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when will the blocks of workshops be available? Do you know?
Hopefully within the next month.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience of offering workshops? How was that?
All I wanted to do was put together a bunch of material that really helped me in a framework and in a format that I think is simple and elegant, and that helps navigate the world of politics, healing, and spirituality really simply. I've even got I've got what I call my magic diagram that I have put in there that kind of shows how conditioning, leverages the human fear, absolute fear of being alone, and how the two of those create repression, that creates stress, that leads to addiction, And this is how we repeat this cycle and over and over. This becomes our comfort zone. So the whole thing about healing is getting out of this comfort zone. And then when you relate that to the political sphere, you can see that the individual work is crucial, because if everyone is stuck in this conditioned pattern, it's going to be reflected in the collective work that we do inevitably. And, if you bring together a group of people who only have in common, in the case of feminism, their sex and their oppression, including their conditioning, oppression includes conditioning, well, then that means that the biggest part of the activism is going to reflect the conditioning, because that's one of the biggest things they have in common. So that means that healing is crucial, absolutely crucial, individual healing to any political work. It's not separate, it's not lesser, it's absolutely part of it. It's crucial.
Mm-hmm.
One teacher who I follow has this quote where she says, healing yourself takes 1,000 more courage than healing the world ever did.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another perspective on, individual versus collective work. It's scary, and it's important. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Renée, for sharing your thoughts about your work today and talking with me about these philosophical matters and approaches that women can take to liberation and learning about our history. Your books are fantastic, and I hope every woman listening right now will check out Dragon Cloud Press and see them for themselves and order them online. So
thank you so much, Thistle. I'm giving you a hug through my
okay.
Thank you so much. I want to say as well that we met in 2016 when I was just at the beginning of my feminist journey, which felt like my own personal epic, like it was an odyssey. And you and Women's Liberation Radio News has been there for me since the beginning, and I really appreciate that so much. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Renée. Thank you.
That concludes another WLRN extended interview. I hope you enjoyed Thistle's interview with Renée Gerlich. Please see the description for information on how to contact Renée for her upcoming course, Everything I Wish I Had Known, and to purchase her series, A Complete Brief Herstory. And while you're at it, make sure to stay tuned for our next podcast, focusing on death and dying, set to drop on Thursday, November the 4th, 2021. We would love to hear from you, so please remember to like, comment, and share widely, sisters.